The origins of the Silk Road. The geography of ancient trade routes. Close your eyes and imagine an ancient world, before borders, before maps, before names like China or Europe meant what they mean today. Instead, imagine vast stretches of untouched land, rolling deserts, jagged mountains, green valleys, and endless plains. These were the landscapes that shaped the paths of ancient traders. In Central Asia, the land was not easy to cross. The mighty Tian Shan and Kunlun mountains guarded the routes like silent stone giants. Deserts such as the Taklamakan and Gobi stretched endlessly, whispering the wind's secrets to those daring enough to pass through. Rivers like the Oxus and the Syr Doria gave life to oasis towns, tiny flickers of civilization in a harsh wilderness. These natural features didn't just shape the land, they shaped history. Traders had to adapt, weaving their roots around nature's design. That's how the Silk Road was born, not as one straight road, but as a web of trails, shortcuts, and seasonal paths, twisting across thousands of miles. It was geography that connected east and west, not out of intention, but necessity. Mountain passes and desert tracks became gateways. And slowly, step by patient step, a road was formed, not carved in stone, but worn into the earth by camels' feet, hooves, and footsteps over generations. Early trade in China and Central Asia. Long before the Silk Road was called by that name, people traded goods across regions. In China's Yellow River Valley, early civilizations grew millet and later rice. Farther west, in Central Asia, nomadic tribes roamed the grasslands with their herds, trading meat, hides, and horses. As early as 2000 BCE, the Chinese were crafting silk, soft, shimmering, and unlike anything the West had ever seen. Meanwhile, Central Asian tribes had something else the Chinese desired: strong, fast horses. The Chinese needed cavalry, and the nomads needed fine goods. This trade wasn't grand or global at first. It began with small, local exchanges. A roll of silk for a pair of horses. A sack of spices for a handful of jade. Over time, those simple swaps built trust and curiosity. What else lay beyond the next mountain? What goods, what stories, what cultures? Even before the Silk Road had a name, its soul had already been born. The urge to connect, to trade, to discover, that was already flowing between ancient settlements. The rise of the Han dynasty. Now, let us journey to the year 206 BCE. The Qin dynasty had just collapsed, leaving China in turmoil. But from that chaos rose a new power, the Han dynasty. Stronger, wiser, more organized. It would be the Han who turned a collection of footpaths into a network that would echo through history. The Han emperors saw the value of trade, not just for goods, but for alliances. They wanted to extend their influence westward, beyond their borders. But to do that, they needed to understand who lay beyond the deserts and mountains. So, they sent explorers, diplomats, traders, and soldiers. The Han didn't just open the road, they protected it, expanded it, and gave it structure. They built roads, established rest stations, and created outposts. From Chang'an, their glorious capital, goods began to flow westward: silk, lacquerware, iron tools, and in return came horses, gold, and stories from distant lands. Under the Han, the Silk Road didn't just become real, it became official. Zhong Qian's diplomatic missions. Zhong Qian is a name whispered across centuries. He was a court official sent by Emperor Wu of Han around 138 BCE. His mission? To find allies against the Xiongnu tribes that threatened China's borders. But what he found was something far more profound. Captured by the Xiongnu and held for years, Zhong Qian eventually escaped and continued west. He reached places the Chinese had only imagined: Fergana, Bactria, and lands beyond. He saw unfamiliar cultures, strange fruits, and powerful horses. When he returned years later, he brought with him stories, maps, and knowledge. He hadn't just gone on a diplomatic mission, he had rediscovered the West for the East. Thanks to Zhong Qian, China learned that beyond the mountains, there were kingdoms willing to trade. His journey, though filled with hardship, laid the foundation for what would become the Silk Road. And it all began with one man, on horseback, braving the unknown, naming the Silk Road. Interestingly, the Silk Road wasn't always called that. The name Silk Road came much, much later, only in the 19th century, coined by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. Before that, the route had no single name. To the Chinese, it was simply a trade route to the west. To the Central Asians, it was a network of trails and oasis stops. To others, it was just the way to reach another land. But silk was the most precious and sought-after good. It glittered. It flowed. It symbolized status and mystery. So when historians looked back, they named the route after its most famous export. Silk Road. A poetic name. A name that hides the danger, the sweat, the sand, and the thousands of lives spent walking its length. A name that now feels timeless, but is in truth quite young. The role of silk in ancient China. Silk wasn't just fabric. It was art. It was wealth. It was identity. In ancient China, the secrets of silk production were guarded with the utmost care. Only the Chinese knew how to cultivate silkworms, how to reel their threads, and how to weave the shimmering material. Revealing the secret was punishable by death. The Chinese didn't wear silk casually. It was reserved for royalty, nobility, and important rituals. Even their scrolls were made of silk before paper became common. And yet, they knew its value. To outsiders, silk was magical. Roman nobles would pay its weight in gold. Kings would exchange it for jewels. Merchants would risk deserts and bandits for a single roll. Silk was more than trade. It was influence. It carried China's identity across the world, one thread at a time. First, caravan routes. The earliest caravans weren't large, perhaps just a few camels or donkeys, loaded with goods, led by patient traders. But as trade grew, so did the caravans. Caravans became long chains of animals and people, sometimes stretching for miles. Camels, strong, sturdy, and able to survive on little water, became the lifeline of desert trade. They could carry silk, spices, ceramics, and more across hostile terrain. These caravans didn't travel alone. They relied on guides, guards, translators, and scribes. Rest stops called caravanserais dotted the route, offering water, shelter, and safety. Travel was slow, sometimes only 15 miles a day. But every step was progress. Every day brought them closer to the next city, the next deal, the next story. And so, the Silk Road grew, not from roads, but from footsteps. The Persian and Central Asian connection. While China laid the Eastern foundation, the middle of the Silk Road belonged to Persia and Central Asia. These lands, Bactria, Sogdiana, Parthia, were bridges between worlds. Their people spoke many languages, followed many gods, and held a long tradition of trade and diplomacy. Persian merchants were known for their skill and honesty. The Sogdians, especially, became the master traders of the Silk Road. They established colonies from China to India, acting as the link between empires. These middlemen didn't just carry goods, they carried culture. They spread languages, art, music, and even religion. The Persians brought Zoroastrianism. The Sogdians carried Buddhist texts. The Central Asians brought stories that would one day echo in European fairy tales. They were the heart of the Silk Road, quiet, busy, and eternal. Early goods exchanged. It wasn't just silk. From the east came jade, lacquerware, ceramics, paper, and tea. From the west came gold, wool, glass, and horses. There were spices, cinnamon, pepper, saffron. There were seeds and fruits, grapes, pomegranates, walnuts. And there were ideas, writing systems, philosophies, beliefs. Sometimes, even people were exchanged. Slaves, servants, scholars, and monks. Each brought something new to the lands they entered. Trade was more than transaction. It was transformation. The Silk Road before it was silk. Before the Han Dynasty, before Zhongqian, the Silk Road already existed in spirit. Nomads traded with farmers. Villages exchanged tools and grains. Priests carried myths and legends. Before there were empires, there were people walking, meeting, sharing. The Silk Road is older than we think. It is not a Roman road or a Chinese wall. It is a human instinct. The instinct to connect, to wonder, to explore. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, think of those first traders. Their lanterns flickering in the desert wind. Their footsteps light on ancient sands, walking, always walking, into history. The Han Dynasty and the birth of long-distance trade. Emperor Wu's vision for expansion. Close your eyes once more and step into the grand, candlelit halls of the Han Imperial Court. The year is around 140 BCE. The emperor sits on a carved jade throne. His name is Emperor Wu of Han, and his ambitions stretch farther than the eye can see. Emperor Wu didn't just want to rule China. He wanted to secure its borders, enrich its coffers, and extend its cultural reach far beyond the mountains and deserts. He saw trade not only as an economic opportunity, but as a political and strategic tool. Horses from the western regions, alliances with distant kingdoms, and the power to influence the world beyond China's frontiers, that was his dream. He knew silk was valuable, but to expand trade, he needed protection for merchants, roads to guide them, and diplomacy to soften the journey. Under his leadership, China began looking west, not with fear, but with purpose. Thus began one of the most important transformations in ancient history, the shift from isolated kingdom to global participant. Infrastructure and road building. For trade to flourish, roads must exist. And not just any roads, safe, reliable, and well-maintained paths stretching across mountain ridges and desert plains. The Han Dynasty launched extensive infrastructure projects. Roads were carved through hillsides, bridges were built over rushing rivers, and rest stops, known as post stations, were established every few dozen miles. Here, travelers could find food, shelter, and fresh horses. These places offered protection not only from the elements, but from bandits who haunted the wild. But these weren't paved highways. Often, they were dirt paths trodden smooth by the hooves of animals and the souls of 1,000 traders. Still, with guards stationed along routes and guides familiar with the terrain, these ancient tracks connected places once thought unreachable. The Silk Road was never a single path. It was a living network, and the Han Dynasty gave it bones. The importance of horses. In the highlands of Fergana, modern-day Uzbekistan, roamed powerful, muscular horses, unlike any the Chinese had ever seen. They were fast, they were strong, and they were called heavenly horses. The Han Empire needed these horses. Their cavalry required them to fight the fearsome Xiongnu, the nomadic tribes to the north and west. And so began the Fergana horse campaigns, a series of military and diplomatic missions aimed at acquiring these prized animals. The Chinese offered silk, gold, and other valuables in exchange. At times, they even went to war to secure them. These horses didn't just change warfare, they changed trade. With them, the Han Dynasty could better patrol the Silk Road, enabling long-distance travel across vast distances. The horse, an animal so common today, became the fuel of ancient globalization. Silk as currency and power. In the Han Empire, silk was more than just a fabric. It was currency, tribute, and diplomatic gift. Government workers were often paid in bolts of silk. Armies received it as reward. Peasants offered it as taxes. Diplomats presented it to foreign rulers as a sign of goodwill and wealth. Its value extended far beyond China. Roman elites cherished it. Indian kings admired it. Persian nobles wore it. Silk was soft, strong, luxurious, and limited to those who could afford its mystery. Because the secret of silk production was tightly guarded, its value remained high. No other region could replicate it. And so, China controlled not only a product, but an entire economic system of desire. Trading posts and outposts. To make long-distance trade possible, the Han established strategic trading posts, small forts and towns positioned along major routes. These posts served many roles. Safe havens for caravans. Marketplaces for goods. Watchtowers for military protection. Rest stations for traveler cities like Dunhuang and Turpan began as dusty settlements and evolved into cosmopolitan hubs, full of merchants from Persia, India, and China. Each outpost was a tiny window to the world. Here, languages mixed, foods blended, goods exchanged hands. A Persian glass might sit beside a Chinese scroll. A Buddhist monk might sleep next to a Roman traveler. The Silk Road wasn't just about transport, it was about connection. The role of Sogdian and Central Asian traders. While the Han dynasty built the road, it was often Sogdian merchants who walked it. The Sogdians were brilliant Central Asian traders, fluent in many languages and deeply familiar with the terrain. They were the middlemen of the Silk Road, moving goods between East and West, brokering deals, and spreading culture. They wore colorful robes, spoke Persian dialects, and carved niches in foreign lands. They weren't just traders, they were settlers. In Chinese cities, Sogdian communities thrived, bringing music, fashion, and even religious ideas. Without the Sogdians, the Silk Road would have been a road without feet. Diplomatic exchanges and gift-giving. Trade was not just a matter of coins and contracts. It was also about prestige, gift-giving, and rituals of honor. Emissaries from the Han court brought gifts to distant rulers. Fine silks, paper fans, lacquered boxes, and golden jewelry. In return, they might receive horses, gems, exotic animals, or rare herbs. These exchanges weren't simply economic, they were political messages. We are powerful. We respect you. Let us be friends, or at least not enemies. Gift-giving helped secure alliances and smooth over cultural misunderstandings. The Silk Road, in this way, became as much a path of diplomacy as of commerce. Spread of Chinese innovations. As Chinese goods traveled west, Chinese ideas and inventions went with them. Among the most important was paper, which revolutionized how knowledge was recorded and shared. It would eventually reach the Islamic world and then Europe, reshaping literacy forever. Other innovations included iron tools, lacquered wood, compass prototypes, ceramics and porcelain. These weren't just products, they were carriers of knowledge. Every item contained a story, a technique, a piece of a distant culture. China wasn't just exporting goods, it was exporting civilization. Military protection of trade routes. To ensure trade thrived, the Han military played a key role. Soldiers were stationed at key points. Watchtowers dotted the landscape. Fortified walls were built along vulnerable stretches. The Hushi Corridor, a narrow strip of land in northwestern China, became a heavily guarded lifeline. Control over this area meant control over the Silk Road. Though trade brought wealth, it also invited banditry and conflict. Tribes like the Xiongnu frequently raided caravans. So the Han responded with patrols, alliances with local tribes, and even preemptive strikes. Trade, in this sense, was not a peaceful enterprise. It was a battle of endurance and strategy. Cultural influence of Han China abroad. As the Han Empire looked outward, the world looked back. Chinese goods sparked fascination far beyond Asia. In Rome, silk became a fashion obsession. In Persia, Chinese dragons began appearing in art. In India, Chinese monks arrived to study Buddhism, bringing home sacred texts. Chinese ways of dress, eating, governance, and philosophy subtly shaped foreign cultures. And in return, China absorbed the flavors of the world, foreign foods, exotic animals, and new ideas. The Han dynasty didn't just build a road. It built bridges of influence, silent but powerful, reaching across continents. Cultures along the road. The Persian influence. Imagine standing in a bustling caravanserai in Central Asia. The scent of saffron and roasted lamb drifts through the air. A merchant in flowing robes inspects Chinese silk, while a storyteller recites lines from ancient Persian poetry. This was Persia's influence on the Silk Road, elegant, intellectual, and deeply spiritual. The Persian Empire, particularly under the Parthians and later the Sassanids, controlled large portions of the Western Silk Road. Their territory became the crucial middle ground between East and West. Goods passed through Persian hands, and so did ideas, religions, and art. Persians contributed astronomy, architecture, mathematics, and literature to the mix. Their language, Middle Persian, became a lingua franca of trade. Their capital cities, like Ctesiphon, welcomed travelers from every land. And the influence didn't stop at goods. Persian designs made their way onto Chinese pottery, and Chinese dragon motifs appeared in Persian tapestries. A mutual admiration took root, layered in color, flavor, and meaning. The Indian subcontinent's role. Further south, the Indian subcontinent played a crucial cultural role. India was not only a source of precious goods, like spices, gems, and textiles, but a spiritual giant whose ideas radiated far beyond its borders. The most significant of these was Buddhism. Buddhist missionaries and monks traveled the Silk Road with sacred scriptures, statues, and stories. They didn't move alone. They were accompanied by artists, architects, and philosophers. In places like Dunhuang, Buddhist cave temples emerged as physical markers of this spiritual journey. Indian mathematics, such as early forms of decimal and zero, also filtered through the Silk Road, influencing Islamic and later European scholars. Even Ayurvedic medicine and Indian cuisine made their mark. India's contribution to the Silk Road was not only material, it was mental, spiritual, and mathematical. The Greco-Roman legacy. To the west, the Greco-Roman world provided a unique blend of art, science, and governance. Though the Roman Empire never directly controlled the Silk Road, its hunger for luxury goods, especially silk, helped drive the entire system. Roman senators draped themselves in Chinese silk robes, despite the Senate's protests about their extravagance. Traders in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome paid fortunes for silk, lapis lazuli, and Eastern spices. But it wasn't just one-way traffic. Roman glassware, coins, and wine found their way into Chinese tombs. And Greek knowledge, especially in astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, filtered through to the Islamic world and eventually reached back to China. Cities like Palmyra in Syria became multicultural hubs where Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Chinese words echoed in the same marketplaces. The classical world shaped the West's appetite, and in turn, fed the flow of ideas and elegance across continents. Nomadic tribes and their contributions. Not all Silk Road participants lived in grand cities or empires. Nomadic tribes, from the steppes of Central Asia to the edges of China, played a key role. Tribes like the Xiongnu, Scythians, Huns, and later the Mongols moved across the landscape with ease. They knew the terrain better than any settled people. Often portrayed as threats or invaders, these nomads were also traders, guides, and cultural transmitters. They brought with them horses, animal products like hides and milk, unique music and oral histories, military innovations like composite bows. In many ways, the Silk Road existed because these tribes allowed it. Their mobility connected otherwise isolated places, and their traditions enriched the cultures they touched. Religion on the road. The Silk Road was not only a path for goods, it was a highway of belief. As monks, merchants, and pilgrims traveled, they carried their religions with them. Buddhism from India spread eastward to China, Korea, and Japan. Zoroastrianism held ground in Persia and Central Asia. Christianity, especially in its Nestorian form, traveled to China. Islam would later follow the road in the 7th century, blending trade with Dawah. Religious tolerance often followed commerce. Many cities along the Silk Road had temples, mosques, churches, and shrines coexisting. The Bamyan Buddhas of Afghanistan, the Jauhar Buddhist ruins, and Sogdian fire temples are all testaments to this shared spiritual legacy. It was along this path that belief systems met, clashed, transformed, and enriched one another. Language and translation centers. To trade and negotiate, people needed to understand each other. This necessity gave birth to translation centers and a class of multilingual intermediaries. In cities like Samarkand, Khotan, and Chang'an, scribes and scholars translated religious texts, business contracts, and legal codes. Entire Buddhist sutras were translated from Sanskrit to Chinese, while Persian merchants used both Arabic and Chinese for commerce. These centers didn't just preserve knowledge, they multiplied it. When texts were translated, they were interpreted, expanded upon, and reimagined. New ideas formed from the blend. A Greek mathematical concept might be translated into Arabic, then passed into Chinese, eventually forming part of the curriculum for a future Islamic scientist. Through translation, cultures spoke to each other, and humanity as a whole became wiser. Art and architecture exchange. Art along the Silk Road was a fusion of styles, a visual language of exchange. From Persian floral motifs to Indian stupas, from Greek columns to Chinese calligraphy, artists took inspiration from what they saw in markets and temples. Examples include the Gandhara style of Buddhist sculpture, blending Greek and Indian forms. Silk patterns with Persian and Roman motifs. Carved cave temples in Dunhuang influenced by Central Asian mural techniques. Architecture. 2. Borrowed and blended. Domes, arches, pagodas, and minarets rose in unexpected places. The Silk Road was a canvas upon which cultures painted, using each other's brushes. Culinary fusions. Perhaps the most delicious aspect of cultural exchange was food. The Silk Road was a corridor of flavor. Spices from India, saffron from Persia, olives from the Mediterranean, and noodles from China crossed paths and pans. Central Asia became a melting pot of dishes. You could find lamb dishes spiced with Chinese star anise, stews mixing Persian herbs and Indian turmeric, flatbreads served with Chinese pickled vegetables. Tea moved west. Wine moved east. Even chopsticks and ceramic bowls became popular across cultures. Food brought comfort and community. Around a table, language barriers faded, and stories flowed as freely as the wine. Clothing and textile influence. The Silk Road didn't just carry silk, it carried style. Clothing styles shifted as new fabrics, dyes, and designs spread across regions. Chinese silk robes were worn in Persia. Persian embroidered tunics found their way into Indian courts. Central Asian traders wore garments that fused East and West, both in form and function. Popular items included silk brocades, woolen cloaks from the steppes, dyed cotton from India, leather boots from Persia. Fashion was both identity and status. What you wore told others where you came from, what you could afford, and what stories you carried. And so, the Silk Road was also a runway, stretching from Lebanon to Rome. Intermarriage and multicultural cities. The longer the Silk Road thrived, the more interconnected its people became. In cities like Merv, Kasha, and Samarkand, marriages between Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Turkic people became common. These unions weren't just personal, they were cultural bonds. Multilingual children, mixed religion households, and diverse marketplaces made these cities early examples of global civilization. Their architecture, cuisine, art, and language all bore the marks of blended identities. These multicultural hubs proved that borders were often more flexible than they seemed, and that when people lived, loved, and traded together, peace often followed. Cities that shaped the route. Chang'an, the Eastern Gateway. Chang'an, known today as Lebanon, was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road and the capital of multiple Chinese dynasties, most notably the Han and Tang. By the time the Tang dynasty came to power, Chang'an had become one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, with a population nearing 1 million. It wasn't just a capital, it was a cultural crucible. The city's layout was meticulously planned. Broad boulevards, marketplaces bustling with foreign traders, towering Buddhist temples, and serene Confucian academies. Here, merchants from Persia, India, Arabia, and Central Asia mingled with locals. Streets echoed with the sounds of dozens of languages. Chang'an was also home to Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian Christian churches, and Buddhist monasteries, showing its spiritual openness. The city's vibrant textile bureau oversaw silk production and distribution, making it the central hub for the fabric that would come to define the entire route. But Chang'an wasn't just a place of trade, it was a dream of East Asian elegance, launching ideas and inventions westward into the world. Samarkand, the crossroads of civilizations. Located in present-day Uzbekistan, Samarkand was a jewel of Central Asia, so dazzling that it stunned even conquerors like Alexander the Great and Tamerlane. Why was Samarkand so important? Because it sat right at the heart of the Silk Road, acting as a crossroads between Persia, India, China, and the Mediterranean. Its blue-tiled mosques, bustling markets, and academic institutions made it a cultural powerhouse. Caravanserais surrounded the city, offering rest to thousands of traders moving in and out. Here, merchants traded not just silk, but also gold, spices, porcelain, manuscripts, and scientific knowledge. Samarkand's Sogdian people were among the Silk Road's finest traders. They spoke multiple languages and were key in facilitating commerce and translation. The city's architectural legacy still stands. The Registan Square, with its enormous madrasas, is a lasting testament to Samarkand's status as a center of learning and exchange. Kasha, the desert oasis. Nestled in the western part of China's Xinjiang region, Kasha was an essential oasis city. It marked the point where eastern and western branches of the Silk Road converged. Surrounded by the Taklamakan Desert and the Karakoram Mountains, Kasha was the last lifeline before traders braved treacherous routes. As such, it was both a place of relief and a hub of transformation. The Sunday Bazaar of Kasha was legendary, where goods from as far as Rome and Lebanon met in joyful chaos. The city also had beautiful mosques, Yuga neighborhoods, and towering minarets that bore the marks of cultural synthesis. Kasha's location made it a melting pot, home to Chinese officials, Persian traders, Indian monks, and nomadic steppe dwellers. Its ancient streets, winding alleyways, and bustling caravanserais told a story of centuries of exchange. Bukhara, the spiritual capital. Like Samarkand, Bukhara lies in modern-day Uzbekistan and was one of the most sacred and learned cities along the Silk Road. While Samarkand dazzled with color and grandeur, Bukhara was more contemplative, known for its libraries, mosques, madrasas, and scholars. It became a vital Islamic center during and after the Arab conquests and was home to many Islamic theologians, philosophers, and scientists. The Kaylan minaret, built in the 12th century, was so magnificent that Genghis Khan ordered it spared during his siege. Bukhara also had bazaars, textile workshops, and carpet weavers, industry mixed with intellect. Trade flowed through its arteries, but so did spiritual ideas. Bukhara helped spread Islam along the Silk Road and offered a home for mystics and travelers alike. Merv, the lost city of enlightenment. Once among the largest cities in the world, Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, is now mostly ruins, but its legacy remains monumental. Merv sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes, making it a key transfer station for goods moving between east and west. For centuries, it was a center of Persian culture, Islamic learning, and commercial exchange. What made Merv special was its diverse population and its libraries, some of the greatest of the Islamic Golden Age. It attracted astronomers, mathematicians, and geographers, who wrote texts that would later influence Europe's Renaissance. Unfortunately, Merv's story is also one of tragedy. When the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, the city was completely destroyed, and tens of thousands were killed. It never recovered. But in its time, Merv was a beacon of knowledge, a place where books traveled farther than spices, and ideas outlasted stone walls. Constantinople, the western edge. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, stood at the western edge of the Silk Road. It was the gateway between Asia and Europe, where caravans ended, and ships began their journey into the Mediterranean. Founded by Emperor Constantine and made capital of the Byzantine Empire, it was an imperial city of immense wealth, dominated by the Hagia Sophia, great palaces, and bustling harbors. Goods from the east, like silk, spices, and porcelain, were received in Constantinople and then shipped to Venice, Genoa, and beyond. The city was also a major religious and artistic hub. Icons, mosaics, and theological debates flourished. The blending of Greek, Roman, and Eastern influences made it a true Silk Road city. Its walls protected not just the city, but also the final stop of countless journeys that began in distant lands. Anch and Palmyra, hubs of antiquity. These ancient cities in modern Syria played a significant role in the early days of Silk Road commerce. Anch, located near the Mediterranean Sea, was a key terminus where land routes from Persia and Central Asia met sea routes to Rome and Alexandria. Palmyra, further inland, was a wealthy oasis city, home to temples, monumental architecture, and wealthy merchants who dealt in silk, ivory, pearls, and incense. Both cities served as cultural buffers between East and West. They housed Greek scholars, Arab traders, Roman administrators, Persian emissaries. Palmyra's Queen Zenobia even challenged Roman power, reflecting the city's ambition and wealth. Although eventually overtaken by shifting empires and destroyed in wars, these cities were vital chapters in the Silk Road story. Dunhuang, gateway to the western regions. Dunhuang was more than a city, it was a spiritual and artistic sanctuary. Located at the edge of the Gobi Desert, Dunhuang was a major stop for travelers heading west from China's heartland. Its greatest legacy is the Mogaro Caves, a complex of over 700 Buddhist grottos filled with murals, scriptures, and sculptures. These caves are a visual encyclopedia of Silk Road culture, documenting centuries of artistic and religious fusion. Dunhuang was also a center of translation, where monks rendered Indian scriptures into Chinese, creating bridges between spiritual traditions. Its role as a resting point, cultural reservoir, and gateway made Dunhuang a sacred waypoint in the Silk Road journey. Baghdad, the center of knowledge. Though slightly off the main Silk Road route, Baghdad became a magnetic force pulling in goods and genius alike. Founded in the 8th century by the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad was home to the House of Wisdom, where scholars from across the known world translated texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese. In Baghdad, goods from the East were studied, replicated, enhanced. This applied not just to materials but to ideas, astronomy, medicine, geometry, and philosophy. Baghdad helped repackage Eastern knowledge for the Western world. Its markets were full of Chinese porcelain, Indian spices, and Central Asian textiles. And its scholars were busy preserving, challenging, and building upon everything they learned. Baghdad was less a trade hub than a knowledge node, linking intellects across continents. Venice, Europe's end point. On the far western end of the Silk Road, beyond Constantinople, lay Venice, a city that thrived on maritime trade and ambition. Venice wasn't part of the overland Silk Road, but it was where silk and spices met the sea and moved into the heart of Europe. Venetian merchants like Marco Polo made the journey east and brought back stories, technologies, and luxuries that shaped European tastes and imaginations. The city was filled with warehouses of Persian carpets, docks overflowing with Chinese ceramics, currency minted from Silk Road silver. Venice's wealth and culture were fueled by its access to the East. Through trade, it became a jewel of the Renaissance, transforming the cultural and economic future of Europe. The commodities of the Silk Road. Silk, the fabric that named a network. Silk wasn't just a luxury textile. It was a symbol of elegance, diplomacy, and secrecy. Originating in ancient China, the production of silk was one of the most guarded secrets of its time. For centuries, the Chinese monopoly on sericulture, silk production, gave them enormous leverage in international trade. Silk was lightweight yet strong, lustrous and dye-friendly, highly sought after by royalty and elites across Rome, Persia, Byzantium, and beyond. Romans paid gold by the ounce for silk, and the demand became so overwhelming that Emperor Tiberius once banned silk clothing for being too decadent. The fabric also became a diplomatic tool, used in tributes, treaties, and marriage alliances. Caravans carried bolts of silk across the Taklamakan Desert, into Samarkand, and all the way to Venice. Eventually, silk production spread to Korea, India, and even the Byzantine Empire. But Chinese silk always remained the standard of excellence. Silk didn't just name the route, it defined its aesthetic and ambition. Spices, fragrance, flavor, and fortune. Spices were the aromatic lifeblood of the Silk Road. More than just culinary enhancements, they were also used in medicine, rituals, embalming, preserving food. The most prized spices included cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from India, cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands, Indonesia, saffron from Persia, turmeric and ginger from South Asia. European demand was insatiable, so much so that during the Middle Ages, peppercorns were used as currency. A pound of cloves could be worth more than a pound of gold. Arab and Indian traders served as intermediaries, bringing spices overland and by sea into Central Asia, from where they continued westward. The movement of spices made empires rich, funded voyages, and inspired wars and treaties. Spices were fragrant proof that taste could drive history. Precious stones and gems, the sparkle of exchange. Jewels gleamed brightly in the Silk Road's long shadow. From the mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan came lapis lazuli, a rich blue stone used in everything from Mesopotamian amulets to Renaissance paintings. India exported diamonds, rubies, sapphires. Persia dealt in turquoise, carnelian, onyx, and from Sri Lanka came moonstones and cat's eye gems. These stones weren't merely ornamental. Lapis was ground into pigment for illuminated manuscripts. Turquoise adorned royal armor. Carnelian was carved into seals and talismans. Many gemstones were believed to hold protective or healing powers, making them both luxury items and spiritual tools. Traders carried them in small silk pouches, carefully wrapped, often traded alongside gold and incense in imperial courts and desert caravans. Paper, the revolution in sheets. The invention of paper changed everything. Originally developed in China during the Han Dynasty, around 105 CE, paper slowly made its way westward through the Silk Road. Before paper, writing was done on papyrus in Egypt, parchment in Europe and the Middle East, silk or bamboo slips in China. Paper was cheaper, lighter, and easier to store. When the Battle of Talas in 751 CE resulted in Chinese prisoners being taken by the Abbasids, paper-making technology was transferred to the Islamic world. This shift led to the explosion of knowledge across Baghdad, Damascus, and later, Europe. Markets along the Silk Road sold paper in various forms, used by bureaucrats for documents, scholars for books, monks for religious texts. Paper helped ideas move faster than goods. Without it, the Golden Age of Islam, the Renaissance, and even modern science may have arrived centuries later. Porcelain, white gold from the East. Porcelain, often referred to as white gold, was a prized Chinese invention. With its fine texture, lightness, and translucence, Chinese porcelain became an elite commodity in Europe and the Islamic world. Porcelain was made from kaolin clay, fired at high temperatures to create a glassy, hard, and beautiful material. Designs often featured dragons and phoenixes, peonies and lotus flowers, scenes from myths and daily life. The Tang and Song dynasties perfected the technique, and the Ming blue and white porcelain became especially iconic. Traded westward via the Silk Road and maritime routes, porcelain graced the tables of Venetian nobles, Mamluk emirs, and Persian kings. Europeans tried to replicate porcelain for centuries. Not until the 18th century did they succeed, proving that Chinese porcelain wasn't just art, but a technological marvel. Horses, the engines of empire. Though less talked about, horses were among the most valuable Silk Road assets. Chinese dynasties, especially the Han and Tang, imported superior Fergana horses from Central Asia. These heavenly horses, as they were called, were faster, stronger, and essential for warfare and communication. In return, the Chinese offered silk and gold. This horse-for-silk trade was so important that emperors launched military campaigns to secure supply routes. Nomadic empires like the Xiongnu, Mongols, and Turks used horses to build and control vast territories. For them, horses were livelihood, shelter, and weaponry. Caravans used horses and camels to haul goods across treacherous terrain, and many cities along the Silk Road doubled as horse markets. Without horses, no empire could expand, and no Silk Road caravan could survive. Incense and perfumes, sense of spirituality and status. From frankincense and myrrh in Arabia to sandalwood and agarwood in India and Southeast Asia, incense was a spiritual currency. Used in temples and mosques, court rituals, burial rites, healing ceremonies. Fragrance was more than luxury, it was divine atmosphere. Perfumes made from rose oil, civet, musk, and ambergris traveled in delicate vials, often traded in small quantities but at immense value. Islamic perfume-making techniques advanced due to contact with Persian and Indian aromatics, while Europe developed a taste for Eastern fragrances through Venetian merchants. To inhale a scent was to connect with heaven, and incense smoke often marked the path of prayer across continents. Glassware, fragile beauty from east and west. Glass was traded in both directions along the Silk Road. The Romans were early masters of glassblowing, and their intricate goblets, beads, and window panes traveled eastward. Meanwhile, Islamic artisans created stunning colored glass and mosaics that dazzled Chinese and Indian buyers. Chinese and Central Asian traders were fascinated by Roman green-blue glassware, Byzantine perfume bottles, Islamic glass lamps. Glass was fragile, but its transparency and shimmer made it irresistible. It adorned palaces, shrines, and wealthy homes. Over time, Islamic glassmakers incorporated Chinese motifs, and Chinese ceramicists tried to mimic the look of glass in glazes. This mutual inspiration transformed glass from a craft to an art of global exchange. Gold and silver, the currency of trust. While barter was common, precious metals became the universal language of value. Gold and silver were mined in Central Asia, India, and Anatolia, minted into coins by the Romans, Parthians, Abbasids, and Tang Chinese, used for jewelry, religious icons, and diplomatic gifts. Coins often had the faces of emperors or religious symbols, messages of authority and faith carried in traders' pouches. Caravans carried silver ingots, bracelets, and filigree work to cities where weights and purity were tested with precision. These metals ensured trust in long-distance trade, stabilized markets, and even served as emergency reserves for cities and empires. Without gold and silver, the Silk Road would have had no shared standard of value. Livestock and exotic animals, creatures of curiosity and commerce. Camels, yaks, oxen, and mules were not just transportation, they were trade goods themselves. But the Silk Road also carried zoological wonders across continents. Lions from Africa, peacocks from India, pandas from China, parrots and monkeys from Southeast Asia. These animals were gifted to emperors, shown off in royal courts, and kept in private zoos or temples. They symbolized power, mystery, and dominion over nature. The Han Chinese once sent a giraffe to the court of a Central Asian king. Arab rulers bred cheetahs for hunting. Even medieval Europeans wrote fables about dragons based on exaggerated traveler tales. Animals traveled in cages, wagons, and sometimes walked beside caravans. They too were ambassadors of the Silk Road, living, breathing symbols of the world's vast diversity. The people of the Silk Road. Chinese traders and envoys, emissaries of the East. The Chinese presence on the Silk Road began in earnest during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE. One of the earliest and most significant figures was Zhong Qian, a diplomat who journeyed westward and opened up relations with Central Asian kingdoms. Chinese traders were often government-sponsored envoys, private merchants seeking luxury good, Buddhist monks on pilgrimage. They carried silk, porcelain, and tea, Chinese scrolls, maps, and calligraphy tools, gifts and tribute items. Chinese envoys followed strict codes of conduct and often interacted with foreign courts on behalf of the emperor. Along the way, they built watchtowers, relay stations, bureaucratic outposts. Their journeys were filled with peril, bandits, blizzards, and political intrigue. Yet the Chinese persisted, because their civilization saw trade as a bridge to peace, culture, and imperial grandeur. Persian merchants, masters of middle exchange. Persia, modern-day Iran, was geographically central to the Silk Road, and Persian merchants became vital intermediaries. The Sassanid Empire, 224 to 651 CE, was especially active in Silk Road commerce. Persian traders were skilled negotiators, fluent in multiple languages, Persian, Aramaic, Greek, Sanskrit, experts in textiles, dyes, spices, and perfumes. Their cities, Ctesiphon, Nishapur, and Ray, became bustling trade hubs. Persian merchants operated caravanserais, collected tolls, and even funded caravan guards. Persian culture influenced much of Central Asia through architecture, poetry, legal systems. Zoroastrian fire temples stood near Buddhist stupas, showing a blend of spiritual ideas fostered by Persian openness. Persians didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, craftsmanship, and a sophisticated commercial ethic that would shape Islamic trade for centuries. Arab caravaneers, desert navigators of commerce. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Arab merchants rapidly expanded their presence along the Silk Road. From Damascus to Mecca, Arab traders formed long-range caravan networks, maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, diplomatic ties with Central Asian rulers. Their caravans were known for discipline and efficiency, use of camels, ideal for arid routes, the spread of Islamic law, Sharia, in commerce. Arab traders helped introduce Arabic numerals, the astrolabe, and advanced banking systems. They also contributed to translation of Greek and Indian texts into Arabic, scientific exchange, philosophical discourse across faiths. The Arab role in the Silk Road was more than economic. It became a spiritual and intellectual artery that connected the ancient world with the emerging Islamic civilization. Indian traders and monks, carriers of karma and commerce. India's role in the Silk Road was profound and multifaceted. Indian traders offered spices, textiles, ivory, and gems, exotic animals and peacocks, religious texts and Buddhist scriptures. But it was the Buddhist monks who perhaps had the deepest impact. Clad in saffron robes, they journeyed across Gandhara, Khotan, and into Dunhuang, spreading Dharma, Sanskrit manuscripts, iconography of the Buddha. Monasteries became centers of hospitality for traders, cultural exchange, translation between Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan. Indian mathematicians also influenced the spread of the decimal system, zero, and astronomy. India was not just a source of material wealth, it was a spiritual and scientific powerhouse on the Silk Road. Central Asian nomads, the lifeblood of the steppe. The nomads of Central Asia, including the Sogdians, Scythians, Xiongnu, and later the Turks and Mongols, were essential facilitators of the Silk Road. Though often seen as barbarians by settled empires, nomads had deep knowledge of the terrain, networks of loyalty and kinship, superb horsemanship. They offered protection to caravans for a fee, transport animals like camels and horses, trade in fur, livestock, and meat. The Sogdians, in particular, were known as interpreters, traders, diplomats. They were cosmopolitan, building cities like Samarkand and Bukhara that became cultural melting pots. Nomads ensured the Silk Road stayed open, even when great empires fell. Their mobility was their strength, and they stitched continents together like invisible threads on horseback. Buddhist pilgrims, sacred travelers of the Dharma. The Silk Road became a path of pilgrimage for Buddhist monks seeking sacred texts, relics, or enlightenment. Notable pilgrims included Faxian, 4th century CE, traveled from China to India, chronicling Buddhist sites. Xuanzang, 7th century CE, journeyed across deserts and mountains to Nalanda University in India. Monks traveled with manuscripts, statues of the Buddha, prayer wheels, and relics. They helped translate texts from Sanskrit to Chinese, spread Buddhist architecture and iconography, establish monasteries along trade routes. The pilgrims' stories filled scrolls and inspired generations. They bridged geography and belief, showing that faith could travel as powerfully as silk or gold. European explorers and traders, the latecomers. Europe's involvement with the Silk Road began tentatively but grew stronger over time. One of the most famous figures was Marco Polo, 13th century, a Venetian who traveled to the Mongol court of Kublai Khan. His book fascinated Europe and ignited dreams of the East. European traders sought spices, porcelain, silk. They brought wool cloth, silver, religious relics. But unlike earlier traders, Europeans were driven by a thirst for discovery, Christian missionary zeal, imperial ambition. Eventually, this led to the Age of Exploration, where maritime trade began to rival the overland Silk Road. Europe's late entry didn't diminish its role. It reshaped global trade, and it was inspired by tales born from Silk Road legends. Mongol guards and administrators, the empire that secured the road. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongol Empire created the largest contiguous land empire in history. They established the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability across Eurasia. The Mongols built relay stations and postal systems, protected caravans with military escorts, standardized weights, measures, and currencies. They welcomed merchants, missionaries, scholars. Even Marco Polo marveled at the safety of traveling through Mongol lands. The Mongols understood that wealth flowed from trade, and they facilitated it with ruthless order. Their rule transformed the Silk Road from a risky venture into a superhighway of cultural and commercial exchange. Translators and cultural interpreters, bridges between worlds. Every Silk Road caravan needed at least one interpreter, someone who could speak across the divides. These individuals were often multilingual: Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Greek, Sanskrit, Turkic, familiar with local customs and trade laws. Key in avoiding misunderstandings that could lead to violence or loss. They were not just language experts, they were cultural diplomats. They explained etiquette, bartered deals, and smoothed over tensions. Some interpreters became legends in their own right, spies, advisors, and even lovers of powerful rulers. Without them, no caravan could cross more than a few hundred miles. They were the invisible ligaments holding the Silk Road together. Slaves, servants, and laborious, the invisible majority. Behind the glamour of silk and spices were the nameless millions who made the Silk Road function. Slaves were bought and sold in Central Asian markets, used as domestic servants, porters, and concubines, taken during wars or raids. Laborious built roads, bridges, caravanserais, servants, cooked for caravans, tended camels and horses, translated messages. Their lives were often harsh, short, and unrecorded. Yet their work was essential. They remind us that while emperors and merchants basked in glory, it was the toil of the unseen that kept the Silk Road alive. Cities and civilizations along the route. Chang'an, the eastern terminus and imperial capital. Chang'an, modern-day Lebanon, was the grand eastern starting point of the Silk Road during the Han and Tang dynasties. It was one of the largest cities of its time, with a population over 1 million, a political and cultural hub, home to the imperial palace and government offices, a cosmopolitan melting pot with merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims from across Asia and beyond. Chang'an's city plan inspired other Silk Road cities, with massive walls, wide avenues, and markets selling goods from India, Persia, and Rome. It was the launching pad for countless traders and travelers who ventured westward. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia. Samarkand, located in modern Uzbekistan, was a key crossroads city renowned for its wealth and culture. It flourished under the Sogdians, famous merchant entrepreneurs. The Timurids, especially during Tamerlane's rule in the 14th century. Samarkand was famous for its stunning Islamic architecture, madrasas, mosques, and mausoleums, being a center of learning and arts. A vibrant bazaar where spices, silk, and precious stones were traded. The city's location on the Silk Road made it a gateway between East and West, blending Persian, Turkic, and Chinese influences. Bukhara, the city of scholars and merchants. Also in modern Uzbekistan, Bukhara was another crucial Silk Road city. It became an important religious and intellectual center, home to Islamic scholars, Sufi mystics, and poets. Caravanserais offering shelter for traders and animals. Markets known for textiles, jewelry, and paper. Bukhara's historic old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, reflecting its deep historical role in connecting trade and culture. Kasha, gateway to the west. Kasha, now in western China's Xinjiang region, was a vital Silk Road hub at the intersection of multiple caravan routes. Key points include serving as a bustling market town where goods from East Asia and the Middle East exchanged hands. Hosting traders from diverse backgrounds, Uyghur, Persian, Turkic, and Chinese. Being a strategic military and trading outpost for empires seeking control of Central Asia. Its vibrant bazaars were filled with silk, spices, jade, and horses. Dunhuang, the oasis of art and faith. Dunhuang was a crucial oasis on the Silk Road's edge, famous for the Mogaro Caves, an immense complex of Buddhist murals and manuscripts dating from the 4th century onward, serving as a refuge and resting place for travelers crossing the Taklamakan Desert. A cultural crossroads where Buddhism, Taoism, and Nestorian Christianity met. The manuscripts discovered there have provided historians priceless insights into Silk Road life. Palmyra, the desert city of commerce. Palmyra in modern Syria was an ancient oasis city linking Mediterranean and Silk Road trade. Known for its wealthy merchant families who built grand colonnades, temples, and public baths, acting as a bridge between the Roman Empire and Eastern trader. Unique blending of Greco-Roman and Persian architectural styles. Palmyra's strategic location allowed it to flourish until the rise of maritime routes lessened overland trade importance. Anch, Mediterranean port and cultural crossroads. Anch, near modern-day Turkey, was a major Mediterranean terminus for Silk Road goods entering Europe. It was an important Roman city and early center of Christianity. A bustling port where silk, spices, and other luxury goods were imported and exported. A melting pot of Greek, Roman, Syrian, and Armenian cultures. The city's position made it an early link connecting Silk Road trade with Mediterranean and European markets. Constantinople, the western terminus of the Silk Road. Later known as Istanbul, Constantinople was a crucial Silk Road endpoint on the European side. Under the Byzantine Empire, it was a fortified city guarding the gateway between Asia and Europe. A thriving market city where Eastern goods were sold to Western consumers. A center of political power, religion, and art. Its famous markets, like the Grand Bazaar, have roots in this ancient trading legacy. The oasis cities of Central Asia, life in the desert. Several smaller oasis towns dotted the Silk Road, providing vital water and rest for caravans. These included Turpan and Korla in modern-day China, Merv and Nisa in Turkmenistan, Khiva and Urgench in Uzbekistan. These cities supported agriculture through ingenious irrigation, offered safe lodging, and became cultural hubs blending nomadic and settled lifestyles. The rise and fall of Silk Road cities. The fortunes of Silk Road cities waxed and waned based on political stability or invasion, Mongol conquests, Islamic expansions, shifts in trade routes, especially the rise of sea routes in the late medieval period. Environmental factors like desertification or river course changes. The goods of the Silk Road. Silk, the fabric that named a road. Silk was the Silk Road's most iconic and valuable commodity. Originating in ancient China as early as 2700 BCE, it was a luxurious, lightweight, and durable textile made from the cocoons of silkworms. Highly prized by Romans, Persians, and Byzantines for clothing, wall hangings, and banners. Originally a closely guarded Chinese state secret, punishable by death if revealed. Chinese silk traveled westward along with embroidery techniques, dyeing technologies, sericulture manuals, later smuggled to Central Asia and Europe. Silk symbolized status, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. It wasn't just a product, it was a currency, a gift, and sometimes even armor, when layered and hardened. The fabric's prestige helped define the identity of the Silk Road itself. Spices and fragrances, scented treasures. The Silk Road carried exotic spices that transformed culinary and religious practices. Key examples: cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg from Southeast Asia. Saffron and cardamom from India. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. Uses included food preservation and flavoring, religious rituals and offerings, perfumes and medicines. These goods were light, aromatic, and high in value, perfect for long-distance trade. The spice trade helped establish maritime offshoots of the Silk Road in the Indian Ocean. Fragrances like attar of roses, sandalwood oil, and musk were also widely sought after in courts and temples from Constantinople to Chang'an. Gold, silver, and precious stones, the glittering currency. The Silk Road was a highway for precious metals and stones. Major exports included gold from the Roman Empire, Byzantium, and India, silver from Persia and Central Asia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, used in jewelry and Renaissance paintings, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds from India and Sri Lanka. These items served as wealth storage and trade currency, were exchanged for goods like silk and spices, adorned religious icons, palace decor, and royal regalia. Jewelry designs and gem-cutting styles also traveled with these commodities, influencing artisans across the continent. Glassware and ceramics, fragile luxury. From Roman glassmakers to Chinese porcelain artists, the Silk Road connected the ancient world's finest craftsmanship. Key items included Roman glass cups and bowls, highly valued in China and Persia. Chinese porcelain and celadon, prized in the Islamic world. Lusterware and mosaic tiles from Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate. These goods were fragile, but often transported carefully with protective straw padding, dedicated camel carriers, custom-built chests. They were often exchanged as gifts between rulers or sold to wealthy families who used them for feasting and display. Ceramics and glass were both art and status symbols. Paper and printing, spreading knowledge. The invention of paper in China, 105 CE, revolutionized communication. It reached Central Asia by the 7th century, and the Islamic world by the 8th. Key impacts enabled wide circulation of religious texts, Quran, Buddhist sutras, boosted literacy and bureaucracy, allowed record-keeping for trade, taxes, and law. The city of Samarkand became a major paper-producing center after Chinese papermakers were captured in battle. Paper was lighter and cheaper than parchment and silk, and it traveled alongside ink, brushes, and printing blocks, culminating in the early mass production of books and calendars. Horses and livestock, the engines of empire. Animals played a critical role in Silk Road economies and warfare. Chief among them, Fergana horses from Central Asia, known for speed, strength, and stamina. Camels, essential for crossing deserts like the Taklamakan and Gobi. Yaks, donkeys, and oxen, used for cargo, food, and labor. The demand for superior horse breeds led to state-sponsored trade missions, military exchanges, ritual sacrifice and breeding programs. Horses were also symbols of prestige, featured in tapestries, tombs, and imperial ceremonies. They weren't just cargo, they shaped the power balance between empires. Textiles and carpets, threads of culture. In addition to silk, the Silk Road traded wool from Persia and Central Asia, cotton from India, linen from Egypt and Rome. Elaborately woven textiles and carpets were used in royal courts and religious sanctuaries, symbols of regional identity and artistic style, exchanged as diplomatic gifts. Persian carpets, in particular, became legendary for their color, craftsmanship, and complexity. Textile motifs often carried religious or tribal meanings and sometimes served as coded messages between different cultures. Books and scrolls, words on the wind. The movement of books on the Silk Road changed history. Major texts included religious scriptures, Buddhist, Islamic, Christian, Zoroastrian, scientific manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, and math, philosophical works from Greece, India, and China. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian missionaries carried handwritten scrolls, palm leaf manuscripts, illuminated codices. Libraries flourished in cities like Dunhuang, Baghdad, and Bukhara. Some texts were copied in multiple languages, preserving ideas long after the original civilizations vanished. Medicine and remedies, healing across borders. Along with material wealth, the Silk Road facilitated the trade of medical knowledge and substances. These included Ayurvedic herbs from India, Chinese acupuncture needles and ginseng. Persian and Greek texts on surgery, hygiene, and anatomy. Traders also carried dried herbs and spices used as antiseptics. Mercury, opium, and sulfu. Coral, amber, and animal bones used in spiritual healing. Hospitals and pharmacies arose in major Silk Road cities. Knowledge was translated, tested, and expanded, laying the groundwork for future medical science. Oddities and curiosities, wonders from afar. Some Silk Road goods were less practical and more mystical. These included exotic animals, lions, elephants, parrots, mechanical toys and automatons from China and Byzantium, astrological charts, mirrors, and fortune-telling stones. Rulers collected these to impress visitors or showcase the empire's wealth. Merchants capitalized on curiosity, selling wonders of the world to nobles and mystics alike. These items may not have been practical, but they fired the imagination and sometimes altered how entire civilizations saw the world. Religions and beliefs along the road. Buddhism, carried by monks and merchants. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia, China, and beyond, riding the same paths as silk and spices. Key developments. Missionary monks like Faxian and Xuanzang traveled west to collect scriptures. Buddhist monasteries were built near trade routes, serving as rest stops for merchants. The Gandhara art style, blending Greco-Roman and Indian influences, emerged along the Silk Road. Temples, stupas, and cave complexes, like Mogaro in Dunhuang, preserved sacred texts and art. Buddhism provided moral codes and cosmologies that resonated across cultures. It adapted to each region, becoming Mahayana in China, Tibetan Buddhism in the Himalayas, and Theravada in Southeast Asia. Islam, a faith on the move. With the rise of the Islamic caliphates from the 7th century onward, Islam rapidly expanded eastward. Key points. Muslim merchants helped establish mosques and communities in Central Asia and India. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand became Islamic cultural and scholarly centers. Pilgrims and scholars spread Islamic law, science, art, and architecture. The Hajj pilgrimage shared overlapping routes with trade paths, further linking religious and commercial life. Sufi mystics traveled along these roads, emphasizing inner spirituality and attracting converts. Islam brought new systems of governance, banking, and education that reshaped urban life along the Silk Road. Nestorian Christianity, eastward to China. Nestorianism, a branch of early Christianity, spread eastward via Persian missionaries. Key highlights. Reached China during the Tang dynasty in the 7th century, recorded in the Nestorian stele. Found acceptance among some Central Asian tribes and elites. Built churches and translated texts into Syriac and Chinese. Though it eventually waned, it left traces in texts and stone inscriptions. It showed how Christianity's story extended far beyond Europe. Nestorians also played diplomatic roles between distant courts, bridging gaps with shared ethics and languages. Zoroastrianism, the fire of Persia. Zoroastrianism was the dominant religion of the Persian empires before Islam. It influenced many Silk Road travelers and thinkers. Key elements. Worship of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of good. Temples with sacred fire altars. Concepts of dualism, good vs evil, which impacted later Abrahamic religions. Zoroastrian merchants spread its values along trade routes, and traces can be found in Central Asian art and architecture. Though diminished after the Islamic conquest of Persia, Zoroastrianism remained a cultural force for centuries. Hinduism, cultural influence through trade. Though less missionary-focused, Hinduism still influenced the Silk Road through temples and trading outposts in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Indian art, philosophy, and cosmology found in local motifs and texts. Sharing of ideas related to karma, dharma, and rebirth. Traders from India brought idols, holy books, and epics like the Ramayana, which became embedded in regional traditions, e.g., in Java and Cambodia. Many Hindu gods and myths blended with local deities, reflecting a flexible and enduring religious influence. Taoism and Confucianism, guiding principles of the East. While less focused on expansion, both Taoism and Confucianism deeply shaped Chinese civilization and spread informally. Taoism emphasized harmony with nature, simplicity, and mysticism. Confucianism focused on ethics, hierarchy, and family loyalty. These systems influenced laws, education, and civil service, art and literature, healing practices like traditional Chinese medicine. Travelers to China often encountered these philosophies woven into governance and daily life. Taoist texts even reached Japan and Korea via maritime extensions of the Silk Road. Judaism, the diaspora on the Silk Road. Jewish communities thrived in Silk Road cities such as Kaifeng, China, home to a Jewish community by the Song dynasty. Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of Jewish trade and learning. Persia and Baghdad, hubs of Jewish legal scholarship. These communities maintained trade networks, kosher practices, and religious study while adapting to local cultures. Jews often acted as intermediaries between empires and faiths, given their widespread diaspora and linguistic skills. Shamanism and local folk beliefs. Across the steppes, deserts, and mountains, local religions flourished. Shamanic rituals among Turkic and Mongol tribes. Animism, ancestor worship, and nature reverence in Tibet and Siberia. Protective amulets, charms, and ritual dances to ensure safe passage. These beliefs coexisted with organized religions, often blending into hybrid spiritual practices. Shamanic practices traveled alongside goods, influencing art and performance across Eurasia. Religious syncretism, where beliefs blended. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it mixed ideas. In many places, Buddhist and Zoroastrian motifs appear together in cave art. Christian crosses sit beside Buddhist stupas in Central Asia. Islamic calligraphy decorates buildings with Chinese-style roofs. This religious syncretism was a hallmark of Silk Road civilization, a sign of cultural respect, creative adaptation, and coexistence. It also made the region more resilient to conflict by creating shared symbols of understanding. Pilgrimage and devotion, travel in the name of faith. Not all travelers were merchants, many were pilgrims. Examples include Xuanzang, who traveled from China to India to collect Buddhist scriptures. Muslim pilgrims on their way to Mecca who shared Silk Road routes. Christian missionaries seeking to evangelize or reconnect with distant churches. These pilgrims brought texts and relics, built shrines and monasteries, recorded their journeys, preserving vivid cultural snapshots. Religious devotion became a powerful motivator for long-distance travel, and often laid the groundwork for peaceful cultural exchange. Decline and legacy of the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire and the road's revival. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and later his descendants, created the largest contiguous land empire in history. This had profound effects on the Silk Road. Reunified much of Eurasia under one administrative system. Instituted Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and security for traders. Improved infrastructure, postal systems, and protection of caravans. During this time, trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange flourished. Merchants, missionaries, and even European explorers like Marco Polo could travel vast distances safely. But this revival wouldn't last forever. The Black Death and its impact. In the mid-14th century, the Silk Road became an unwitting highway for the Black Death, likely carried by fleas on rats traveling with caravans. Spread from China to Europe in a few short years. Killed tens of millions, up to 60% of Europe's population. Trade slowed dramatically. Cities were emptied, ports shut down, and entire regions became isolated. The psychological and economic trauma reshaped global priorities, leading to greater caution in international travel and trade. The plague also diminished trust in overland routes, pushing future traders toward maritime options. The rise of maritime trade routes. By the 15th century, sea trade became increasingly attractive. Faster and safer than long, overland travel. Could carry larger volumes of goods. Less susceptible to political instability and banditry. The Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and British explorers turned their attention to ocean routes. Around Africa to India and China. Across the Atlantic to the Americas. This marked a shift from the Silk Road to the Sea Road, relegating land routes to regional use. Political fragmentation and regional wars. After the Mongol Empire fractured, the Silk Road splintered. Successor states like the Timurids and Ottomans focused on local control. Border conflicts disrupted continuity. Road maintenance and protection declined. Trade became riskier and more expensive. Routes fragmented into smaller circuits, many of which never recovered their former vitality. Merchants increasingly opted for safer coastal cities or joined state-sponsored maritime ventures. The fall of Constantinople and the Ottoman shift. In 1453, the Ottomans captured Constantinople, closing a vital bridge between Asia and Europe. Consequences included increased tariffs on overland trade, European efforts to find alternate routes to Asia, intensified exploration, leading to the Age of Discovery. While the Ottomans revitalized parts of the Middle East, their monopoly on land routes made Silk Road trade less accessible to Europeans. The Renaissance in Europe was fueled partly by this search for new markets, ironically inspired by Silk Road knowledge and goods. The end of the road, by the 17th century. By the early 1600s, the main Silk Road arteries had faded. Caravans diminished in size and frequency. Empires like the Qing dynasty and Safavids focused inward. Trade still occurred, but mostly on a local or regional scale. Maritime empires now dominated global commerce, and land trade had become secondary. This marked the end of the classical Silk Road, though its memory endured in maps, chronicles, and legends. Cultural legacy, art, language, and cuisine. Though the trade slowed, the cultural fingerprints of the Silk Road remained. Art styles mixed Buddhist, Islamic, and Christian elements. Languages like Uyghur, Persian, and Arabic influenced local dialects. Foods, spices, and cooking techniques, like noodles and dumplings, crossed continents. These cultural echoes are still visible today in textiles, architecture, and culinary traditions across Eurasia. The Silk Road left a shared artistic and human heritage, uniting distant peoples through beauty, taste, and story. Scientific and technological transmission. The Silk Road had long been a conduit for ideas. Arabic numerals, paper, and compasses spread to Europe. Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian medicine traveled east. Even as trade ended, the knowledge continued to flow, now by sea or through printing presses. Modern science owes much to this ancient web of exchange, a legacy of cross-cultural curiosity and collaboration. Modern revivals and historical memory. In the 20th and 21st centuries, governments and scholars revisited the Silk Road. UNESCO designated Silk Road sites as World Heritage Locations. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, aimed to build new infrastructure on old paths. Museums, documentaries, and literature rekindled global interest. The idea of the Silk Road now lives on as a metaphor for globalization and interconnection, for dialogue between civilizations, for the risks and rewards of crossing borders. What the Silk Road teaches us today. The Silk Road teaches timeless lessons. Trade isn't just economic, it's cultural and spiritual. Movement of people and ideas enriches civilizations. Cooperation, not isolation, builds enduring prosperity. It also warns us. Epidemics, war, and fear can unravel even the most vibrant networks. True legacy lies in knowledge, relationships, and shared human values. The Silk Road may no longer carry camels and caravans, but its spirit continues to inspire us toward a more connected world.